What's the latest story out of the fictional Bois Sauvage, Mississippi?
I write about people like the people I grew up with and like people in my family. And so I think there's real worth in being around the kind of people that I write about.
Jesmyn Ward will be here to discuss her new novel, Sing, Unburied, Sing. Why 5 new books about Darwin now?
The sample we have here that we look at in the review is representative in some ways of the more readable books.
David Dobbs will be here to talk about the latest takes on the theory of evolution. How do you go from writing a best-selling high fantasy YA trilogy to a standalone novel that breaks all genre definitions?
In order to write a book, you have to have this passion to write this particular book, and I don't have a lot of control over what idea is going to attract me and make me passionate.
Kristin Cashore will be here to talk about her new book, Jane Unlimited. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Jesmyn Ward joins us now from San Francisco, where she is on tour for her new novel, Sing, Unburied, Sing. Jesmyn, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is an exciting moment for you because the book came out, I think, was it September 5th?
Mm-hmm.
And already getting great reviews and longlisted for the National Book Award.
Yes.
Which you won for your first novel, Salvage the Bones. Does it bring you back to that moment?
Yes, it does. I don't know. I mean, I'm overjoyed, right, that I was longlisted for Sing, but then I also remember the amount of stress, that being, I guess, longlisted or, on one of the finalists for this award brings. And so I've rediscovered that, right? Because, like I said, I'm happy that I've been longlisted, but then you worry, right? And you wonder if you'll make the next cut, and and then if you make the next cut, then you wonder about what will happen on the awards night. So yeah, it's great, but also a little stressful.
Right. Stressful, but in a good way.
Yeah.
And that novel, Salvage the Bones, that won the National Book Award in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
But you took a detour after that novel, and I feel like you're becoming a multi-hyphenate writer because you edited an anthology last year called The Fire This Time. You wrote a memoir, Men We Reaped. Can you talk a little bit about sort of why you moved away from fiction, a little bit about those 2 books, and then what brought you back?
I mean, I've always been fascinated by creative nonfiction, so I always knew that there were some stories that I had to tell, that I needed to tell in that form.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the most important of those stories was the story of my brother and my friends and my cousin. So after Salvage the Bones, after I finished that draft, it just seemed like the right time to try to tell that story that required, that I tell it using creative nonfiction, that I write the memoir. And I wrote it, but creative nonfiction doesn't come easily to me. It's something that I have to work really hard at, in order to, I guess, even with shorter pieces, right? Not just creative nonfiction book length work, but even shorter essays.
Mm-hmm.
They take a lot of time. I mean, it's not as if my fiction doesn't take time too, but there's something about writing a rough draft of fiction that it's easier than writing creative nonfiction for me. So anyhow, I told that story, I wrote my memoir, and then I just encountered so many voices. There were so many, younger writers or newer writers coming up who were saying, I felt really essential things about race and about America. And so then that's why I further detoured and edited the anthology of essays and poems about race in America right now. But at the same time that I was actually working on Fire This Time, I was also writing the rough draft of Sing, Unburied, Sing. So I think, as I was working on, The Fire This Time, I wanted to return to fiction. I wanted to be, in a fictional world with characters. I wanted to be in that space again. And so I dove back into fiction.
Men We Reaped was about 6 young African-American men who were in your life, as close as your brother, who died. Did you think about approaching it through fiction?
Briefly. I mean, it would have been much easier in some ways, it would have been easier for me to fictionalize that and to write that story as a novel because, then I wouldn't have had to deal with all the fallout that I dealt with in my personal life with, people that I wrote about. Men We Reaped was problematic for some people in my family and in my community, and I wouldn't have had to do that, to deal with that, but I felt like the only way that I could be truly honest about what happened was by writing, that story as a memoir. And I don't know, I just felt like the only way that I could truly honor the young men was by making them into characters, in the memoir and writing, a true account of what we lived through. I wanted to use their names. I wanted to, use like specific, characteristics and details about them. I just felt like the memoir was the right way to do that.
Was the hard part, I'm sorry to go so deeply into this, but it's interesting to explore the differences between fiction and nonfiction. For some people who are natural nonfiction writers find it terrifying to make things up. But it sounds like in this case, was the difficulty sort of laying out those facts, or was the difficulty the personal component to it?
Yes, it was definitely the personal component. There's a battle on every page where I was thinking about what actually happened, like assessing the truth, and then figuring out how much of the truth would make it to the page, and then what I would withhold, because I was also thinking about, the people that I was writing about, right, who were still alive, and the effect that, that my writing would have on them. And so every page, I had to make some sort of decision. Okay, well, I'll tell this, but I have to hold this back. That was really difficult. And I also think that, that I write about a lot of painful events, right? And one thing that I've learned about myself and my process when I'm writing creative nonfiction is that I'm not the bravest when I'm writing, especially a rough first draft. I tend to write around the pain. I avoid it, I shy away from it, and I sort of circle it, right? Instead of confronting it head on. And so therefore, it takes me multiple drafts to come to like a good place in my creative nonfiction where I'm looking squarely, at whatever painful thing I'm writing about. But yeah, so that's another reason that writing creative nonfiction is really hard for me, because I avoid in my writing. And so, it's up to my friends and my editor to read what I've written and to really push me towards, writing about these things that I'm avoiding in some ways.
In this book, in Sing, Unburied, Sing, like your previous fiction, you set it in a fictional place, in Bois Sauvage. Tell us about that place and why you choose to set your stories there.
Well, I think that Bois Sauvage is an idealized version of my hometown, perhaps, and the surrounding areas. So my hometown is this like small town on the bayou on the Mississippi Gulf Coast called DeLille. It's very rural. There's a core black community there. Many in that core black community are working class and poor. And then, of course, it's in a beautiful place. And I think that all those factors combine to make it into a place that nourishes the characters in some ways, but also at the same time savages them, like it threatens them, it bears down on them. I feel like there's a puzzle in places like that. I just like I feel like I don't fully understand my hometown. So maybe that's why I wanted to, write this fictionalized version of it, so that perhaps I can understand it a little better, understand how it affects me and how it affects all the people who live there and have lived there.
You moved back to Mississippi. Is that important to you, to your work, to be there, to be in that setting?
In one respect, it is, because I write about people like the people I grew up with and like people in my family. And so I think there's real worth in, being around the kind of people that I write about, hearing the way that they speak and, watching the way that they move. Like, I think that keeps me honest, I think. Like, I have a complicated relationship with the place that I'm from because, on the one hand, I can see the value in living there again in the hope that it helps, lend some honesty and urgency to my writing. But at the same time, it's still Mississippi. And there's much about Mississippi, about politics in Mississippi that is really problematic for me.
How much has it changed from the place that you grew up in?
In some ways, it's changed a lot, especially after Katrina. It's become a little less rural. I mean, even though, for someone from New York, it would still be, entirely rural, right? But for me, it seems less rural because a lot of people, moved north, away from Pakistan, away from the Gulf after Katrina. And so, they settled, in my town. So it feels a little more crowded. When I was growing up there, it also, in the late 80s, mid-80s to late 80s, and then into the early 90s, we experienced the crack epidemic. And now, meth is everywhere. And there's no longer a crack epidemic where I'm from, but there's now a meth epidemic. And meth, unfortunately, the kind of effects that it has on people who are, battling that addiction, I mean, it's changed people. It's changed behaviors. I don't know. I feel like it's, one effect of the drug is makes people more paranoid. I'm definitely seeing that. I'm seeing people, very young people, I feel like, people who are, young men and women who are in their early 20s, battling meth addiction. And I don't know if that was the case with the crack epidemic. And it's everywhere. So that has definitely changed too.
Okay, without going too much into the plot, but just to give us a little teaser, and we'll end on that, tell us what this book, Sing Unburied Sing, is about. Okay.
Sing Unburied Sing follows a family from the Mississippi Gulf Coast up into the heart of Mississippi to the Delta, to Parchman, as they journey to Parchman Prison to pick up one of the members of the family from the jail. But at the same time that it's a novel about a road trip, right, about a journey, it's also, in some ways, because in some ways the travelers, as they journey north through Mississippi, in some ways they're journeying back into the past, into Mississippi's past, into the past of this country. So, in a nutshell, that's what Sing is about.
Well, I think that will certainly pique people's interest. So I will leave it to readers to find out the rest. The book is called Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. It's just been longlisted for the National Book Award. And of course, Jesmyn won the National Book Award for her earlier novel in 2011, Salvage the Bones. Jesmyn, thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
David Dobbs joins us now. He reviews this week in the book review 5 books on Charles Darwin, and he is also the author of a book on Darwin himself. His own book is Reef Madness, Alexander Agassiz, Charles Darwin, and the Meaning of Coral. David, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
I'm tempted to talk to you about coral and Darwin, and hopefully we'll get to that at some point. But you reviewed 5 books about Darwin, other people's books in this week's issue. So we'll start there. I'm going to just go through the titles of these books quickly for our listeners, and then we can talk a little bit about 4 of them, and then I think go really more deeply into the main one that you write about. And that book is The Evolution of Beauty, How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us by Richard Prum. So before we talk about that book, quickly, the other ones are Darwin's First Theory, Exploring Darwin's Quest to Find a Theory of the Earth by Rob Wesson, Darwin's Backyard, How Small Experiments Led to a Big Theory by James Costa, Collecting Evolution, the Galapagos Expedition that Vindicated Darwin by Matthew James. And finally, Purpose and Desire, What Makes Something Alive and Why Modern Darwinism Has Failed to Explain It by J. Scott Turner. You start off your review by saying it's not unusual to have this number of books about Darwin come out at a given time. Tell us a little bit about Charles Darwin in books, the numbers.
Yes, 5 books is just a tiny spoonful of Darwin from the stream that comes out every year. I looked all this up, and there are around 160 books a year presently published on Darwin. There have been about 7,500 or more published about Darwin since he wrote The Origin of Species in 1859. So there's one every 2.3 days lately, and so this is, let's see, 5 books would be, about 12 days worth. But I chose the sample we have here that we look at in the review is representative in some ways of the more readable books. A lot of those books, of course, are very academic, but for popular readers, this is a reasonable sample of the kind of thing you'll get every year. There's one, Scott Turner's Purpose and Desire is one that this happens fairly often. He's attempting to add something, not to completely disrupt Darwin's theory or the Darwinian theory of evolution we now use, but to add something to it. He feels that today's mechanistic neo-Darwinism, as we call Darwinism these days, needs to find room for the agency or the desire that Turner sees driving most life forms. And this is everything from the plant's desire to reach the sun to desire for food or new spaces and so on. This is going to run into a lot of skepticism because it's not very mechanistic, and it attributes evolution to agency, which is something that most evolutionary biologists would see simply as an expression of other needs. I found it a really interesting book. As I said in the review, it's a good read. He writes very well. He's a very engaging writer, and it's a strong pitch, but I'm not quite buying that we need to revise neo-Darwinism that way. But it's a lovely read, and others will probably disagree with me on that.
I want to pause you there for a second to explain, what do we mean by neo-Darwinism?
Well, neo-Darwinism, it's to sort of recognize the development of Darwinian evolutionary theory over the last 170 years since Darwin published his theory of evolution through natural selection. So it incorporates what's called the modern synthesis of the mid-20th century, which found a way to essentially reconcile Darwinian theory that came straight from Darwin with Mendelian genetics. The genetics, in most people's view of evolutionary biology and neo-Darwinism, that's the final proof that Darwin had it right. It's the mechanism by which selection works. So when we speak of neo-Darwinism, we're really speaking of a full-fledged modern Darwinism that incorporates all the latest science. So you won't mistake it for an early form of Darwinism. For lay people, I think we can usually consider them more or less the same.
Since you mentioned early Darwinism, let's go to another book that seems like a natural leap here, Darwin's First Theory by Rob Wesson. What was his first theory?
Darwin's first real mature theory was his theory of coral reef formation. And this is something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. But
except in your
Wesson,
book.
Yes, I wrote a whole book about this, actually, called Reef Madness, as I think you mentioned up front. And Darwin was a geologist mainly when he got on the Beagle. This was his main interest. He took a couple of thousands of pages of geology notes on the cruise and a few hundred of zoological. He was far more interested in geology than he was zoology at the time. And he was reading Lyell's book that was such a radical view of the Earth that saw the Earth as constantly changing rather than reflecting one static form. And this colored his view of everything he saw on the Beagle trip. And most especially, it colored his view of geology. He was absolutely fascinated with geology. And when he was on the west coast of South America, a huge earthquake occurred lifted parts of the ground 3 feet that you could see the change evident. And he happened to be there to see it. Places he had seen a week before now looked different. They were 3 feet further out of the water and so on. So he got to thinking about how all this works, and he was looking at the charts of the Pacific and how the coral reefs out there looked. And the coral reef problem, as it was known in the 19th century, was one of the biggest controversies in science in Victorian England. And so he wanted to cut his teeth on that. He came up with a new theory about how coral reefs form. This was brand new, and his theory was that they formed as islands sank into the sea. It's called the subsidence theory. And when they first started to sink, a coral reef formed around their edge, and when they sunk further, there was an island surrounded by a lagoon, and then the coral reef. And finally, when the island sunk completely underwater, you just had a round coral reef, an atoll. This was a brilliant insight that he took home, and Charles Lyell was so pleased with it, he actually danced around the table and when he told him at dinner. And then he published this book very soon after his return. He was working on it on his way back. So this is his first substantive theory, and it was a very deductive theory. In other words, he had this idea before he even saw the reefs. The reefs confirmed his idea, and then he came home and published it. So it anticipated, it's important because it anticipates in two ways his theory of evolution through natural selection. One, it's the same sort of mental process. He has an idea, and then he looks for evidence and builds a case around the idea, successfully in both cases. The other way it anticipates it is because he's answering a question, why do the coral reefs look like that? By looking at how they may have changed form slowly over eons in response to environmental pressures. So it's a template for his theory for evolution for natural selection. And it's his journey that Rob Wesson both recreates and follows on foot in his book, Darwin's First Theory. And he does a lovely job of weaving Darwin's historical journey with his own. It's quite a nice read and brings alive a theory that I think is overlooked in Darwin's work and explains a lot about how he worked later.
All right, let's stay with the journey at sea. And the next book is Collecting Evolution, The Galapagos Expedition That Vindicated Darwin by Matthew James. What's this book about?
Well, this book is about this one particular trip that a legendary field naturalist, Rollo Beck, took in 1905 to 06, so about a half a century after Darwin visited the Galapagos, and collected all sorts of things, wildlife there from the islands, that basically brought into science a lot of raw material that could be looked at to test what Darwin had concluded from what he saw in the Galapagos. This is a book that is not even aimed at a necessarily wide popular office. It's at a Oxford University press, a very good press, but distinctly an academic one. It's very colorful. Beck is a colorful character. There was a lot of drama on this. There were a couple of deaths, a lot of psychic angst because of the isolation and the hardship they went through. And Rollo Beck himself is a very interesting character. So for people who like expedition stories, there's an extra star. And likewise, if you're particularly interested in Darwin, the book goes from a 3 or 4 star book to a 5 or 6 star book, I think.
Well, let's hope all the people who would read these books are at least to some extent interested in Darwin. The last book is kind of different, I think, in terms of its the way it's structured. Darwin's Backyard, How Small Experiments Led to a Big Theory. And I like this on the title, on the front cover. It says, including do-it-yourself experiments. And this book is by James Costa. Did you do any of these experiments?
It's a really charming book. It's a wonderful idea that when I first saw it, I sort of thought, this is going to be sort of devicey and too cute. But his writing is very good on how his descriptions of Darwin's experiments at home, which haven't gotten a lot of attention in books of popular science, are very good, and they show how what he was doing was colored by the social milieu around him and by his own thoughts, and how they followed up things he'd done on his global expedition. And it's this picture of this lively kind of messy house in which you're doing experiments on potatoes and peanuts and bees, barnacles. And the add-ons at the end of these chapters are actually quite charming. Some of them are very simple things, and others experiments you can do to crossbreed beans or something, and others are just observations. This sort of combination of seeing Darwin do the work and then getting a chance to make an observation that he made, I found very alluring. It's a really enjoyable book and an unusual one, contribution to the Darwin literature. All
right, let's turn to the final book, and the one that you discuss at most length in your review, because it sounds like it's an important book, and that is The Evolution of Beauty, How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us by Richard Prum. Tell us what that forgotten theory is to start.
Yeah, I think this book is a big deal and will be seen that way. So what Prum is taking up is what he called in an academic paper Darwin's truly most dangerous idea. He's making a play off of a different book written by someone else, Daniel Dennett. And in Prum's view, his most dangerous idea is his theory of sexual selection. Now, people may remember from biology that the main force at work in evolution in Darwin's theory is natural selection, in which traits are selected because they make you more fit for your environment. So in the beak of the finch, the evolutionary pressure causes finch species on the Galapagos to change the forms of their beak with incredible rapidity, as described in the wonderful book The Beak of the Finch. And this is a selection for fitness. That's natural selection. But there was another thing that intrigued Darwin immensely, and that he had at least as much trouble explaining, and that was, why are some birds distinguished not so much by something like a beak, and this goes for other animals too, but by the ornamentation and beauty of them? Why are some animals covered with ornament and distinguished by it, and what is the root of beauty? Why would you have this? And he sees this, Darwin saw this in a lot of species around the globe, some of them mammals, but most distinctly in birds, where it's the most eye-catching to humans, and where it's also often accompanied by extravagant, elaborate rituals of courtship, where the male tries to woo a female. In Darwin's eyes, this could not be explained as a result of pressure for fitness, because some of these things were very distracting, the big tails of a peacock or a bower bird, or the investment in the time to build these bowers that bower birds build, and then create an entire courtship ritual around luring the female, inviting the female into the bower to examine this artwork that the bird has made.
Often much more flamboyant and prominent in the males than in the females.
Yes, this was the distinctive thing in birds and some other species. The males were the ones more ornamented, and it was the male's place to sell himself as an aesthetic experience, a source of pleasure to the female in order to win the right to mate with her. Mm-hmm. So this, in Darwin's eyes, could not be explained. He really struggled with it, and it was the main and most difficult part of his second book, The Descent of Man. His emphasis on sexual selection was dismissed by a lot of, or downplayed by a lot of his biologist friends. What he was arguing, everyone accepts that sexual selection happens. The question he explores, and that Prum explores, is whether sexual selection is a force that's independent and sometimes contrary to selection for fitness. So there's selection for fitness, and Darwin argued, and now Prum is arguing, much more well-armed than Darwin was, because he has 140 years of science to draw on, that sexual selection for beauty and pleasure is an independent force driving evolution that sometimes works in contrary to the selection for fitness.
In the world of evolutionary psychologists and theorists, how big an impact will this book have or is already having?
It's a little hard to say. There have been reviews here and there on it. There's some of them like the book a lot. At least one hated it. A lot of his attacks are on kind of evolutionary psychology that tells just so stories about things like permanent breasts and so on. They give explanations that aren't satisfactory to Prum. So he's mounting a fairly pointed argument, and one that frankly is potentially extremely disruptive, because this carries all the same baggage and threat in some ways that it did when Darwin proposed this 140 years ago. One thing it threatens directly is the adaptationist view, which sees all significant traits that are under active selective pressure as being selected for fitness. Mm-hmm. In some ways, it calls into question the whole selfish gene view of the centrality of genes in human evolution.
That's the Richard Dawkins.
Yes, exactly. And this is the case because what part of his argument here is that, and he's not emphatic about this, mm-hmm. but he's partly making an argument that culture itself, in the form of sort of consensus and the evolution of female choice, culture itself can become an evolutionary driver, a selective force. And there's a conversation between biology and what's going on in genetics and culture, which is not based so much in genetics. Now, people can and will argue over this they already have for decades, and they probably will continue to. But Prum's book constitutes a particularly well-developed, powerfully argued assertion mm-hmm. that we need to fundamentally change how we view all this and to accept sexual selection as a really strong force that it affects not just individual choices, but that has helped create human culture. For instance, he sees much about sexual relations and the relation between men and women as created through this coevolution between female choice and male's appearance and behavior. He looks at different things that he offers different pieces of evidence that males have changed since we split with the apes, and in many ways that we have.
It sounds like there's still some evolution that needs to take place, though, in accepting these more feminist implications of Charles Darwin's theory.
This will meet some stiff resistance.
All right. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
David Dobbs is the author of several books, including Reef Madness, Alexander Agassiz, Charles Darwin, and the Meaning of Coral. And this week he reviews 5 books about Charles Darwin. Kristin Cashore joins us now. She is the author of a new young adult novel called Jane Unlimited, and she is also the author of a trilogy of YA novels, The Graceling Realm, which is Graceling, Fire, and Bitter Blue. Kristin, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Your previous books, you can describe them as high fantasy, and this is something very different. How would you describe Jane Unlimited?
I suppose I would describe it. It's a bit tricky to describe, but as a sort of kaleidoscopic cross-genre novel. Mm-hmm. It also at least has roots in the choose-your-own-adventure conceit. It's honestly pretty hard to describe. I mean, I could give the little blurb that I give.
Well, that's why I was making you describe it, because I find it hard to describe.
Well, okay, let me put it this way. We have our main character, Jane, who is a young woman, an orphan, and she arrives at this mysterious house on an island where she's been invited by an acquaintance. And she starts to quickly get the sense that something strange is going on here. People are acting weird. People are asking her questions about her past life, and these people people have never even met her before. Even the dog is acting kind of strange. And then at a certain point, she has to make a decision. Who is she going to follow? Is she going to follow the housekeeper? Is she going to follow her acquaintance? Is she going to follow the dog? There are 5 different people that she can follow to try to get to the bottom of what's going on in this house. And at that point, the book splits off into 5 different decisions, 5 different stories from that point, and each story is in a different genre. So there is a mystery story, a spy story, a horror, a sci-fi, and a fantasy story. And all the stories inform all the other stories, and I hope kind of give the reader a sense of opening and possibility and not just a sense of sheer utter confusion.
It's a complicated narrative. You're doing a lot of challenging things at once in this book. Was it a hard book for you to write? Was it harder than the previous books that you'd written?
Every book is equally hard in my experience. I think that if I had tried to write this book first, rather than, the book that I actually did write first, it would have been impossible. I needed more experience. I needed experience with a more complicated narrative before I could have written this book. So I think this book was ultimately more difficult, but it didn't feel more difficult at the time.
One of the interesting experiences for me as a reader of your book is that this is, as I said, it's a young adult novel. My 12-year-old daughter read it and before I did. And then she read it again before I did. And so she was full of knowledge and I think rather contemptuous of my confusion. She wanted to discuss this book way before I was ready and couldn't believe that I was still trying to kind of, grapple with it, that she would say, are you on the part in which someone loses a soul and Charlotte finds one? And, what does it mean? So that was a really kind of interesting experience to read it alongside her. And I asked her if she got more out of it upon a second reading, because I've only read it once. And she said she absolutely did. And I'm wondering if you thought about this book as something that was kind of made sense to kind of immediately turn back and reread it, and if you thought about it in those terms as when you were writing it.
Well, I don't think it would ever be fair for me to expect that of any reader. There are so many books. I have reread so few books in my life, and it's one of the true pleasures to reread a book, but there's always something else I either want to read or am supposed to read. So I wouldn't expect that of readers, but I am absolutely delighted to hear of readers who have decided to do that. It is certainly one of those books, or, there are movies like this too, where, I think immediately of The Usual Suspects, you go back to the beginning and of course you're going to see things, you're going to see the clues that you didn't recognize.
But you must have reread at least 2 books in working on this book, because you refer to them in an afterword. And I think they are clear to those readers who've read those books, the parallels. One of them, of course, is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and the other is Jane Eyre.
I wasn't sure whether you were going to say Jane Eyre or Winnie the Pooh.
Well, Winnie the Pooh, of course, is in there. I'm assuming you went back and you reread those and you worked them in. And why?
Well, I wanted to get the feeling of Rebecca. Also, I love Rebecca. I love the way it's written. I love the structure of it. It is possibly the book I have reread most often, and I've also listened to the audiobook a couple of times. Jane Eyre, I did reread as well. Once I had this mysterious house, this isolated house, and this orphan who was, a young person of little means arriving at this house, then there I had the convention of Jane Eyre or of Rebecca or of Mary Stuart's an incredible novel, 9 Coaches Waiting, which is another one that I reread but didn't really refer to specifically. I just have always loved those books, this sort of unwanted, isolated person finds himself in this isolated, strange, mysterious place, and adventures ensue, and in the process they're trying to learn about themselves and who they are and what they want. So I reread these books just so that there could be fun little links here and there between my book and those books.
For you, though, there were a lot of decisions to make as a writer because you have this moment where a bell rings in the story early on, and Jane, as you said, has a choice. She can follow any number. I think it's 4 or 5 different characters, and you play out each of those characters. For you as a writer, I mean, you could have taken this in so many different directions.
Yeah.
Were there a lot of, sort of starts and stops in this process in which you spun things out and sort of said, you know what, I don't like where that's taking the characters. I don't like the way that's playing out?
So what I did was I planned it out beforehand. I plotted it and mapped it beforehand just because I anticipated that it was going to become so complicated and difficult to have all these moving parts and to be trying to figure things out while I'm actually writing it. With this book, more than any other book I've worked on, anytime I would make a major change in any part of the book, the ripple effects that would create through the rest of the book were really, really huge. And I created a dilemma for myself in revisions. It became very hard to change anything. And I sort of anticipated that before I started. So I mapped it out as best as I could. There were some things that just didn't end up feeling right and didn't end up working, so I changed them. But for the most part, I had my 5 different outcomes that I was trying to get to, and then I sort of had to lay them each on top of each other to make sure they still work.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has to be in the right part of the house at the right time. I can't have someone in a different part of the house in another story, because why would they be? The only reason for anything to change in each story is because this main character, Jane, has made a different choice about where to go. And I hear myself talking about it, and I'm not even sure I'm being clear, and it's partly because the actual writing of the book was such a messy balancing act and involved so many charts and so much going back and trying to check, okay, let's follow this character through. Are they consistent? Let's follow this character through. Are they consistent?
Yeah, it seems like one of those books that it would be a very freeing and exciting as a writing experience, yet then as an editing, quite difficult to go back and to make sure to check for consistencies and inconsistencies and lapses and repetitiveness. And did you have a lot of sort of friendly readers helping you go through the narrative?
I had the kindest readers. When I think back on those first couple drafts that I gave to people expecting them to be able to understand and comment on, and the really, really helpful responses I get, and my editor has, she is so patient. I definitely had a lot of really kind helpers with this book.
Before I let you go, I would hate myself if we didn't talk about the Graceling Realm trilogy just a little bit. Those books you wrote over, I think, a period of 8 years, or the books came out over a period of 8 years. The last one came out in 2012. And as a reader, when I heard that you were doing something different, my initial reaction, if I'm being honest, was disappointment, because I thought, but how could you leave that behind? Was it hard for you to leave Graceling behind?
It wasn't hard for me to leave it behind just because Bitter Blue was so hard and so dark and really had a lot to do with my own life. And so there were ways in which it was a relief to let that go and turn to something a little different. I will say that I don't know that I have completely left the Graceling realm behind. I could certainly write more in that realm.
She's opened the door. She's leaving the door open.
Right. That door is open, yeah.
The 3 books were Graceling, Fire, and Bitter Blue. For listeners who have not read this trilogy, to my mind, it really is. It's one of the best fantasy trilogies, YA trilogies that I've ever read. And my daughter, who just read them, I think had the same reaction. And she's read many books in that genre. You left that genre behind in this book. So even if you don't go back to Graceling, do you want to return to fantasy? Do you see that as kind of your home as a writer, your place? Or is this new genre breaking, bending, Jane Unlimited kind of more the direction that you want to move into?
Well, I didn't really leave that genre behind because there is a fantasy story in Jane Unlimited, and I have to tell you that when I got to that story, which is the last one, and it was time to write it, it was so much easier to write than the other stories, and I realized, oh, wow, I really have
sort of been working this muscle a lot more than I've been working these other muscles.
I mean, without giving away the story, I do want to say that as a reader, that last realm, that fantasy realm, was the one where I thought, now this is a world. I want to know more about this world that she just introduced here at the end.
Well, I've always wanted to write a lot of different things, and I have written a lot of different things. It just so happened that the first thing I got published was Graceling, and Graceling brought out, I thought I was just writing this one fantasy novel. I had no idea I had more in me, but then Graceling brought up these ideas that made me then want to write Fire, and again, I wrote that book thinking this is going to be the last fantasy, but again, that book brought up ideas that caused me to write Bitter Blue. So it really is, it's a little bit out of my control. As I doubt I need to tell you, in order to write a book, you have to have this passion to write this particular book, and I don't have a lot of control over what idea is going to attract me and make me passionate. So I do have, I have another book in revisions right now that is a mystery. I have other types of things I want to write. I know my readers know me as a fantasy writer, but I think of myself as a writer, and we'll see what comes.
All right. Well, that sort of sounds like Kristin Unlimited. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Kristin Cashore's new book is called Jane Unlimited. It is a standalone, at least for now, YA novel, and it is out this week. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's going on in the world of books. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
All right. Sales figures, right?
Yes. There have been some really big books this fall. That's always the case. But probably the biggest nonfiction book that everyone was anticipating was, of course, Hillary Clinton's new memoir, What Happened. And this, of course, recounts her experiences from the 2016 campaign and its aftermath. And the big question everybody had, kind of people in publishing and people in marketing and political pundits, was, are readers and voters does anyone really want to relive this exhausting and volatile election that we all just barely got through? And the answer seems to be yes. The sales figures came in, and from the first week, and according to Simon & Schuster, the book sold more than 300,000 copies in its first week on sale, which is a really astonishing figure. More than 167,000 of those were hardcover copies, and then the additional ones are digital and audio. And it's apparently, according to the NPD book scan analysis, the biggest first week sales for hardcover nonfiction in the last 5 years. So that's pretty substantial. And it's also interesting to kind of compare this to her last memoir, which came out in 2014, and that was called Hard Choices. And that sold around 86,000 print books, so far fewer.
What about Living History?
That's a great question. So that one actually was her biggest debut yet. That one sold 438,000 copies in its first week.
So it's interesting because with that one, everyone, was interested in Hillary's story. But what they really wanted to know was, her side of the Monica thing.
And that came out in 2003. So that was pre-ebook. And those 438,000 copies were all print. So that was a really enormous sort of sales week for her.
It's so fascinating because Hard Choices was her, her big kind of policy book.
Right.
And her memoir of her years as Secretary of State. But when it comes to Hillary Clinton, it seems like what people really want to know is like the real inside.
Exactly.
What was she thinking, feeling, why kind of side of her.
Yes, and she has this reputation for being very evasive, of course. And so I think people were expecting more of the same when it came to this new book. And critics have been very kind to it. I mean, they've said this is absolutely her most revealing book yet, as her publisher promised, but people were sort of skeptical of whether that would come through. There was, of course, a great review in the New York Times by Jen Senior where she called it a score-settling jubilee and very much worth reading.
I want every book to be called a jubilee, or more books to be called a jubilee. What a great word that is.
And then
yes, score-settling isn't bad either.
I mean, I'll read it. And then Politico wrote recently about it and said, this is a quote, "The real headline to come out of this book, a far more engaging read than the problem-rich account of her years as Secretary of State, Hard Choices, is that she has definitively answered the question that has been asked about her for more than a quarter century. Who is she?" So it is interesting. This is, I think a lot of her supporters wish she could have revealed more of herself during the campaign, but at least she's done it now, and her publisher's thrilled.
Yeah, well, she debuted at number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list.
And I think it's also noteworthy that number 2 was Unbelievable by Katie Tur, which is her memoir about covering the Trump campaign. She's, of course, an NBC News correspondent, and that, again, I think speaks to this persisting hunger among readers to sort of get behind the scenes of that election, even though it seemed like every twist and turn was covered breathlessly in real time and everybody sort of sighed when it was over. But apparently there's still an appetite.
They've got me reading. All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Jen Salai join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right. Let's start with John, because you're doing one of our favorite things, the obit read.
Yeah, Pamela and I, if we weren't working here, we would have our blog, Obituary Reads. And last week...
Death Watch. Death Literary Watch.
And last week, or maybe the week before, J.P. Donlevy died, the 91-year-old Irish-American author who is really known best for one novel called The Ginger Man. So I've been reading that because I've been meaning to for many years, and the obituary tripped me into it. I'm actually going to quote not from the book, but from Dwight Garner's great appreciation of Donlevy that he wrote for The Times, in which he said, "In his spectral wit, Donlevy could resemble Samuel Beckett. In his delighted lustiness, Henry Miller. In his damp and scattered wordplay, James Joyce. An American who lived most of his life in Ireland, he spoke to the past century's intellectual and moral dislocations. Like a greased pig, he eluded critical capture."
I love that.
It's great.
The greased pig.
Yeah, it's a great line. It's a very bawdy book. It is very comic and very funny and Joycean for sure. It was written mid-century. But it's also very dark. I mean, the lead character, who's this man named Sebastian Dangerfield, is an American student living in Dublin on the GI Bill, and he's violent. You know, he's not just sort of a good time guy who goes out to the pubs and gets drunk and makes puns. He's violent towards his wife. He's morally very slippery, but the language is really the reason to read it. And it is very funny. And I mean, there's really no plot in this book. It is all about the language and the voice. It's really about this character sort of evading landlords who want back rent and getting into really tight spots in bars, and then sort of, you know, trying to emotionally escape the women in his life. So you don't read it to see what happens next. You just read it to be sort of in Donlevy's company. It's singular, and I would definitely recommend reading it. And there are a bar is named The Ginger Man. I think it started in Texas, and now there's one in Murray Hill in New York.
There's even one in Greenwich, Connecticut, I think.
Yeah, and so it's a chain now, a big chain. And on the wall, at least in the one in New York, there's one of the more famous paragraphs in the book about how basically if it's not one thing, it's another, but said in a much more colorful way. Greg, you've got a couple of things in front of you.
I do. You know, I haven't really landed on what my next book will be, and so I'm doing what I do in those situations, which is kind of casting about and reading about in things. So I turn to collections. I've got 2 collections in front of me. One is fiction and one is nonfiction. The fiction is Tobias Wolff's collection, The Night in Question. I turned to that because it's back to school time, and my son's freshman English teacher in high school assigned one of the stories from this collection in his class. And so the story Powder, and he came home talking about that, and I said, we own that book.
What grade is your son in?
He's a freshman.
Actually, can I interject here? Hopefully it's not getting too personal to say that both you, Greg, and I have sons named Tobias, and which I think is a kind of a literary affectation in terms of naming
Are they both
kids.
named after Wolff?
And there was, for a period, another writer who is also one of our critics who had a Tobias on the same floor at the Times, another son. So anyway.
Yeah, so my son Toby is not named after Toby Wolff, although of course when we named him, we were aware of the overlap. And I'm a big fan of Tobias Wolff, who's probably best known still for his memoir, This Boy's Life. But he's a terrific story writer. His collected stories won the Story Prize maybe 8 or 9 years ago, blowing away some great competition. He's just, he's built a real solid career as a story writer over the years. And this one, The Night in Question, has what's maybe my favorite Tobias Wolff story. It ends with the story Bullet in the Brain, which is about a book critic who is in a...
This doesn't end well.
It doesn't end well, but it ends beautifully. He's in a bank at the time that a stick-up man comes in, and the stick-up man is full of cliches, everyone down on the floor, that kind of thing. And the critic can't stop himself from kind of smirking at all of these cliches, drawing the wrath of the guy who ends up shooting him. And then the whole last half of the story, it takes place in that flash of a second as the bullet is traveling through his brain and firing off all the synapses. And it brings him back to a day in his childhood playing baseball on the sand lot when one of the boy's cousins from the South is in town and is asked what position he wants to play. And he says, shortstop. It's the best position they is. And that phrasing, they is, just resonated. It became kind of the basis of this guy's love of language through his whole life. And it's almost this kind of poetic.
Wow.
And
This actually makes me think of that scene in Take the Money and Run, the Woody Allen film.
Oh,
where there's
right.
also like a writerly problem, because he writes down a note and hands it to the teller. And it says,
the grammar is wrong.
I've got a gun. And he says, what is this? A gub. What is a gub?
It's also bringing to mind for me the scene in Ratatouille where the food critic is sort of brought back to his childhood through the food. He got this like very crusty, cynical food critic takes a bite of the rat's dish.
It's
and it,
very
sends him,
much like that.
Jen, what movie does it make you think of?
Then the other collection that I'm reading about in right now came out a couple of years ago. It's Renata Adler's collected nonfiction. It's called After the Tall Timber. Because I'm a bit of a masochist, I've been greatly enjoying a piece that she did that just lays into the New York Times. She talks about some of the errors that we made at the time of the Iraq War, and she talks about the famous Wen Ho Lee series of articles that we did, and so she's quite scathing about the Times as an institution, but she's and anger.
And she
had worked here.
She did work here, and anger is one of Renata Adler's great virtues as a writer. She's kind of gloriously angry when she wants to be, and it's a very scathing piece. But she's also very funny on the genre of the New York Times correction, the kind of the punctiliousness of our corrections.
We don't know anything about her. What do you mean?
So it's, I read half defensively saying, but in terms of our well-meaning as an institution, and also half ready to be persuaded by her as I read along in this.
That's great.
So those are the two books that I'm reading right now.
Jen has another cheerful entry for us.
I know.
It was interesting because yesterday I was talking to John about this, and I said that I was going to talk about a book that I had chosen because it was lighter reading, but I meant it in the sense that it was less physically heavy than the other book, which
that's not
the other
light.
book is just hard to bring on the subway. So I'm reading that one at home, Simple Justice. But the one that I've been reading on my commute now is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and its subtitle is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. So it's basically his argument, even though it's mostly historical, but he does make very explicit that he has an argument, is that the American government played an active role in segregating neighborhoods in the United States by guaranteeing loans only for developers who would only agree to sell to white people, basically.
It's like the prequel in a way to Evicted, right?
Right.
The Matthew Desmond book.
And yes, and it's also connected. There was a book last year by Mitchell Dunier about ghettos. And so Richard Rothstein explicitly says that this is partly how certain neighborhoods were kept very poor and depleted of resources, essentially, by the government actively acting on behalf of segregationist interests.
And this is a newish book. It was published
This is a
earlier
newest
this year.
book, exactly. And it was published earlier this year, and it was just longlisted for the National Book Award. And I'd had a galley sitting around, and I'd been meaning to read it for a while. So I figured it's also coincides in a way with the Simple Justice book, because where one lives often determines where one's children goes to school. And so all of these things are connected.
Is this the kind of thing that was an open secret and he's just kind of putting the pieces together?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have talked about it before, but I think the argument has often been in terms of residential and real estate segregation, that this was sort of just private interests.
Right. That wasn't codified in the...
Right. And he's saying, no, this was actually explicitly codified because often these private interests either needed or wanted federal guarantees for the money that they needed to do these things. And so, for the government to explicitly say, and it was often couched in terms of words like racial harmony. I mean, the way that it was sort of described was, people feel comfortable living with people of their own race, so this is why we're doing this. It's a really, really sort of shocking, outrageous history.
Yeah, that's a very serious subject, but I wish that George Carlin were alive and could riff on the idea of calling it racial harmony, because just that use of language is so ridiculous.
Yeah. The harmoniousness thing is very,
Luckily, real estate interests no longer have a place in our government.
Right.
I only see a copy of the book review in front of you, Pamela, but
I
that
know,
can't
this
be
is my shame week. I showed off last week too much, and now I'm being punished because I think I came in with like 4 books in front of me. And this week, I'm still reading 2 of the books that I was reading last week. And it's embarrassing because people are going to be like, those are books that you should just get right through, but I haven't. So I'm finishing up Katie Tur's memoir, Unbelievable, which it is pretty unbelievable. I mean, I think that it's very well titled because what she does in that book, as I mentioned last week, is really brings you back to the moment so that you're re-experiencing things that happened in the 2016 election that were sort of historically unprecedented. And you now, of course, we've become kind of inured to some of it, or, it's just hard to experience shock on a daily or hourly basis. But
she's very funny about the famous penis debate, the Marco Rubio small hands comment. And she goes on a little riff in that book where she says, "Can I say penis on air? Do I have to call it mini Trump?"
Yes. You always remark on the penis episodes and everything. Right? So that book I'm finishing up. And then I've started A Perfect Spy by John le Carré. This is the book, I think, where he deals with, in a fictional way, his father. But I'm quite early on in it, so you can expect to hear me talk about it more in the next 6 episodes. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.